She is standing at the window of the East Wing, looking out over the perfectly manicured gardens. The view is breathtaking. Geometric flower beds stretch toward the horizon in precise lines. Gravel paths curve with mathematical precision. The morning light catches the gilded gates and makes them gleam like something from a fairy tale. Behind her, the corridor stretches away in both directions, lined with oil paintings worth more than most people will earn in 10 lifetimes. The chandeliers overhead hold hundreds of candles, and when they are all lit at once, the light they throw is genuinely magical. The footmen move through the halls in perfect livery. The silver gleams like mirrors. The whole magnificent apparatus of the British Empire's heart is running, as it always runs, with the appearance of absolute, effortless perfection. And you, standing somewhere in the middle of all of this, are already dying. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, systematically, through a combination of cold and poison and social pressure and physical demands that your 21st century body has no preparation for whatsoever. This is 1880. Queen Victoria has been on the throne for 43 years. She rules over a quarter of the globe. Buckingham Palace is the nerve center of the most powerful empire in human history. And it is also, by any modern standard of human habitability, a death trap disguised as a palace. Music. This is not a story about glamour, though there is glamour here in quantities that would stagger the imagination. This is a story about what glamour costs, what it conceals, and what it does to the bodies of the people who create it. Because the truth that the portraits and the state occasions and the ceremonial descriptions have collectively agreed never to discuss is this. Buckingham Palace in 1880 was one of the most uncomfortable large buildings in England. It was cold in ways that the word cold fails to capture. It was toxic in ways that would violate every modern safety regulation. It was socially rigid in ways that made spontaneity not merely difficult, but structurally impossible. And it was maintained through a level of human suffering that the people experiencing it had no vocabulary to describe. Because suffering was simply the baseline, the starting point, the atmospheric condition inside which everything else happened. You think you want to see the glamour from the inside. What you are about to discover is why you would not last a week. Your first shock comes not from what you see, but from what you feel. The moment you step inside Buckingham Palace in January 1880, the cold hits you like a physical blow. Not the sharp, clean cold of winter air, but something more insidious, the accumulated cold of centuries. Living in stone walls 3 feet thick, rising up through marble floors that have never been warm. Settling down from ceilings so high that heat simply disappears into them like smoke. There's no central heating. The concept does not exist. The palace is heated by fireplaces, hundreds of them, and the logistics of keeping them burning is a military operation that begins before dawn every single day. An army of coal porters and scullery maids rises at 4:30 in the morning to begin the process, hauling coal up from the cellars, clearing yesterday's ash, laying and lighting new fires. All of this done in absolute silence, because the household above them is still sleeping. But here is the thing about heating a building the size of Buckingham Palace with individual coal fires. It does not work. The palace contains over 600 rooms. The corridors between them stretch for miles. The ceilings soar to heights that would make a cathedral architect weep with envy. And coal fires, no matter how many of them you light, no matter how much coal you burn, produce heat that extends approximately 8 feet from the grate, and essentially nowhere else. The corridors of Buckingham Palace are not heated. They cannot be heated. They are too long, too high, too numerous, and too drafty for any 19th century technology to address. Walking from your bedroom to the breakfast room means passing through spaces where the temperature in winter approaches the temperature outside, which in London in January 1880 means somewhere around freezing. Queen Victoria herself compounds this problem through her personal preferences. She believes with the conviction of someone who has never been contradicted on any subject for 40 years, that cold air is healthy air. She keeps windows open in conditions that her household describes in their private letters with barely concealed desperation. Lady Lytton, writing from Windsor but describing conditions that applied equally to Buckingham Palace, noted that the Queen seemed genuinely impervious to cold in a way that suggested either superhuman constitution or decades of adaptation that had fundamentally altered her relationship to temperature. Her ladies-in-waiting, meanwhile, stood in drawing rooms where the fire was burning on one side of the space and the window was open on the other, wearing the low-necked silk evening gowns that court protocol required, shivering so violently that their jewelry rattled. Arriving with a body calibrated to central heating, to rooms that maintain 72 degrees regardless of outside conditions, to the simple assumption that buildings will be warm, would find the palace's cold not merely uncomfortable but genuinely disorienting. The kind of cold that lives in stone buildings is different from any cold you have experienced. It is not weather. It is architecture. It comes up through the floors and down from the ceiling simultaneously. It gets into clothing and stays there. It makes thinking slower and movement clumsier and sleep impossible, and every hour of every day slightly more effortful than it would otherwise be. By your second day in the palace, you would be wearing every piece of clothing you had brought, and it would not be enough. If the cold does not break you, the atmosphere will. By 1880, London is choking on the Industrial Revolution. The famous pea soupers, the yellow fogs that turn day to night and air to poison, are a regular feature of winter life. That poisoned air does not stop at the palace gates. It seeps through window frames and under doors and into every room where human beings are trying to breathe. But the air inside Buckingham Palace is often worse than the air outside, and the reason is light. The palace is illuminated by gas. Thousands of gas lamps line the corridors, the state rooms, and the private apartments. Gas lighting is the technological marvel of the age, the thing that makes civilization possible after dark, the innovation that separates the 19th century from everything that came before it. It is also a continuous, low-level poisoning system that operates 24 hours a day throughout the winter months. Gas lamps burn open flames that consume oxygen and release byproducts, carbon monoxide, ammonia, sulfur compounds, and a fine black soot that settles on every surface in the building. The lamps emit a constant low hissing sound, like a building full of snakes. They produce heat, which sounds beneficial until you realize that the heat rises to the ceiling while the poison stays at breathing level. During a state dinner, when hundreds of gas jets are burning simultaneously in the ballroom, the temperature near the ceiling reaches over 100 degrees, while the floor remains cold enough to see your breath. The air becomes thick enough to taste. Your eyes water. Your throat closes. Your head begins to pound within an hour, and the pounding does not stop until you leave the building entirely. The plants brought in to decorate the staterooms for formal occasions die within days. The flowers wilt overnight. The gilded mirrors develop a film that has to be cleaned daily by servants, whose lungs are being destroyed by the same fumes that kill the flowers. The marble statues turn gray. The oil paintings darken. Everything in the palace is slowly being coated with a layer of poisonous soot, including the people who live there, you. Arriving with lungs accustomed to filtered air, to buildings with ventilation systems, to the simple expectation that indoor air will be breathable, would begin coughing within hours. By the end of your first evening at a state dinner, you would be genuinely ill. By the end of a week, you would have developed a respiratory condition that Victorian medicine had no tools to treat and no vocabulary to explain, because everyone who lived in the palace had the same condition. It was not a disease. It was simply the price of living in the most advanced building in the empire, Now let's discuss something that the formal histories of Buckingham Palace prefer to gloss over entirely. Where people went when nature called, and what happened to the results. In 1880, the palace's relationship with human waste was a complicated negotiation between Victorian propriety and biological reality. And biological reality was not winning. The palace had indoor plumbing, technically. Water closets had been installed in various locations throughout the building, connected by a maze of pipes to a sewer system that represented the cutting edge of Victorian engineering. But the plumbing was unreliable in ways that would make modern building inspectors weep. The pipes froze in winter. The drains backed up. The traps that were supposed to prevent sewer gas from rising through the system failed regularly, filling entire corridors with smells that no amount of potpourri could mask. More importantly, the water closets were not distributed in anything approaching adequate numbers for the building's population. Buckingham Palace in 1880 housed hundreds of people, the royal family. The household, the servants, the guards, the secretaries, the clerks, the endless stream of officials and visitors who kept the machinery of empire running. Most of these people, most of the time, did not use water closets. They used chamber pots. Every bedroom in the palace contained a chamber pot, kept in a wooden cabinet designed to look like furniture. Every morning, these pots had to be emptied, carried down the back stairs, cleaned, and returned to their places before the upper-class residents opened their eyes. This was the job of the housemaids, who moved through the building like ghosts, managing the biological reality of the palace in absolute silence. If a servant was seen carrying a chamber pot by a member of the royal family, it was a dismissal offense. The bodily functions of the palace existed, but the evidence of them was to be magically erased. The logistics of this system were staggering. Hundreds of chamber pots, filled nightly, emptied daily, by women who earned less in a year than the palace spent on flowers in a week. The physical toll was immense. The pots were heavy. The stairs were steep. The work was constant. Housemaids developed hernias, joint problems, and chronic back injuries that they could not afford to treat and could not afford to complain about. Because complaining about working conditions was itself grounds for dismissal. For you, arriving from a world where privacy and sanitation are basic expectations, the chamber pot system would be a psychological ordeal as much as a practical one. The idea of using a pot in your bedroom, knowing that someone else would have to empty it in the morning, knowing that the person emptying it could not afford to refuse the task, would introduce a level of discomfort that the palace's social system had no mechanism to address. Victorian propriety required that bodily functions be invisible, but it also required that someone, somewhere, handle the reality of them. That someone was never you, but perhaps the most destructive aspect of life inside Buckingham Palace was not the cold, or the poison, or the sanitation. It was the social system itself, a hierarchy so rigid and so comprehensive that it regulated not merely behavior, but thought. Not merely public actions, but private reactions. Not merely what you did, but who you were permitted to be. Life in the palace was not lived. It was performed. Every movement, every word, every piece of clothing was dictated by a set of rules so complex and so unforgiving that a single violation could destroy your social standing permanently. The rules were not written down anywhere. They were not explained to newcomers. They were simply known, the way native speakers know grammar. And the fact that you did not already know them was itself evidence that you did not belong. If you were a courtier, your entire existence revolved around Queen Victoria. And Victoria, in 1880, was a woman who had been in deep mourning for her husband, Prince Albert, for 19 years. The palace reflected her grief in every detail. The atmosphere was somber, quiet, regulated by protocols that turned social interaction into a form of choreography. You could not speak to the Queen unless she spoke to you first. You could not sit in her presence unless explicitly invited. You could not turn your back on her ever, which meant that leaving a room required walking backward toward the door while maintaining perfect posture and a composed expression, navigating furniture and other people without looking, terrified of tripping and causing a scene that would end your career. The ladies-in-waiting, whose official function was to attend and accompany the Queen, occupied a position that sounded glamorous and was actually a form of elegant torture. They stood for hours in freezing rooms, wearing silk gowns that provided no thermal protection, unable to ask for shawls because etiquette forbade acknowledgement of physical discomfort. They accompanied the Queen on walks in weather that would have challenged Arctic explorers, maintaining cheerful conversation while their feet went numb in thin slippers. They sat through musical evenings that lasted until midnight, then rose at dawn to be available for whatever the Queen required, which might be anything from reading correspondence, allowed to standing silently in a corner while she worked. The men of the household had their own version of this ordeal. The court of 1880 was not a place where masculine interests were accommodated. There were no sporting activities, no political debates, no opportunities for the kind of conversation that men of the era expected in their social lives. The court was organized around Victoria's preferences, which ran toward the domestic, the sentimental, and the musical. Grown men, accomplished in their professions, decorated for military service, sat through tableaux vivants and piano, recitals with expressions of polite interest while their minds slowly atrophied from boredom. For you, arriving without any training in this social system, the hierarchy would be a minefield that exploded beneath your feet several times daily. You would sit in the wrong chair, speak to the wrong person, fail to bow at the correct angle, address someone by an inappropriate title. Each mistake would be noted, remembered, and held against you by people whose entire professional identity was built around their mastery of these distinctions. There would be no forgiveness for ignorance, because ignorance of the rules was itself a violation of the rules. Below the level of the courtiers and the Kio, household officials was another world entirely. The servant hierarchy that actually kept the palace functioning. This was where the real work happened, and the real suffering, and the real human cost of maintaining the illusion of effortless perfection. Buckingham Palace in 1880 employed hundreds of servants, organized into a hierarchy as rigid as any military structure. At the top were the upper servants, the housekeeper, the butler, the Queen's personal dressers, people who had worked their way up through decades of service and who commanded genuine respect within their domain. They ate in their own dining room, drank wine with their meals, and were addressed by their surnames. Below them were the lower servants, the housemaids, the footmen, the kitchen maids, the scullery maids, the hall boys, people who worked 15-hour days for wages that barely covered their basic needs. The work was backbreaking, in ways that modern people struggle to imagine. Every piece of coal burned in the palace's hundreds of fireplaces had to be carried up from the cellars by hand. Every gallon of hot water used for washing had to be heated in the kitchens and carried up multiple flights of stairs in heavy copper jugs. Every room in the palace had to be cleaned daily, floors scrubbed, furniture polished, chamber pots emptied, fireplaces cleared and reset, all of this done in silence. At hours when the upper household was not present to be disturbed by the evidence of labor, the servants lived in the palace, in attic rooms and basement dormitories that were unheated, poorly ventilated, and overcrowded. They shared beds, shared clothing, shared the chronic respiratory conditions that came from working in the coal dust and gas fumes that were the palace's atmospheric baseline. They ate the leftover food from upstairs, which sounds generous until you realize that the food had often been sitting for hours in unheated corridors and was frequently spoiled by the time it reached them. The social rules governing servant life were as complex as those governing the household above them, but with higher stakes. A housemaid who was seen by royalty while cleaning had to turn her face to the wall or hide in a closet until they passed. A footman who dropped a dish was not merely clumsy. He was a threat to the palace's reputation. The servants were the invisible machinery that made the visible perfection possible, and their invisibility was not metaphorical. It was literal, enforced, and absolute, for you. Dropped into this system without the lifetime of conditioning that made it bearable for its participants. The servant hierarchy would be as destructive as the courtier hierarchy, just in different ways. The physical labor would break your body within days. The social isolation would break your spirit within weeks. The knowledge that you were expendable, replaceable, and fundamentally unimportant to the people whose comfort you were destroying yourself to maintain would introduce a level of existential despair that the Victorian era had no tools to address. Even eating, the most basic human need, became a complicated ordeal inside Buckingham Palace. The kitchens were marvels of Victorian engineering, occupying a substantial portion of the palace's lower level. Equipped with massive coal-burning ranges that operated continuously and produced heat, sufficient to make working in them during summer genuinely dangerous. The kitchen staff were professionals of real skill, trained in the French tradition that dominated aristocratic cooking throughout the century. The ingredients available to them were the finest that money and empire could procure. And yet the food that emerged from this system and traveled to the dining rooms was often a disaster. The problem was distance. The kitchens were not adjacent to the dining rooms. They were separated by corridors, staircases, and substantial horizontal distances, all of which the food traversed on covered dishes carried by footmen. By the time a dish reached the table, it had been traveling for several minutes through unheated corridors. Hot food arrived warm. Warm food arrived cool. The elaborate sauces of haute cuisine, designed to be served at specific temperatures, congealed during transport in ways that no amount of silver serving dishes could prevent. The formal dining protocol made this worse. Queen Victoria ate quickly, and royal etiquette dictated that once she finished a course, every other plate at the table was immediately cleared, whether the other diners had finished or not. If you were seated at the far end of the table, and the Queen finished her soup before yours was served, you simply did not get soup. Guests regularly left state dinners at Buckingham Palace genuinely hungry, stopping at their clubs on the way home for actual food. For you, arriving with modern expectations about food temperature, food safety, and meal pacing. The palace dining experience would be a series of small humiliations. The food would be cold. The portions would be tiny. The pace would be frantic. The social pressure to appear satisfied, regardless of the reality, would add a layer of psychological stress to what should have been the day's most pleasant experience. Let's trace what would happen to you. Specifically, day by day, as the week progressed and the palace's various systems began their work on your body and mind. Day 1 would be overwhelming, but manageable. The scale of the building, the density of the social rules, the cold of the corridors, the darkness of the rooms by candlelight, all of it would arrive simultaneously, and you would spend most of your energy simply trying to process your environment. You would make social errors, sitting in the wrong chair, addressing people incorrectly, walking into rooms you were not supposed to enter, but you would not yet understand the consequences of these errors. By day 2, the physical systems would be making their contributions. The water, carrying its load of Victorian London's bacterial and chemical contamination, would be producing gastrointestinal symptoms that you would have no framework to explain and no socially acceptable way to address. The cold would be settling into your body, not the sharp cold of weather, but the pervasive cold of stone buildings, making everything slightly harder. The sleep deprivation from the late evenings and early service requirements would be beginning to accumulate. Day 3 would bring respiratory symptoms. The coal smoke and gas fumes would be irritating your throat and lungs in ways that would present as a persistent cough. a rawness at the back of the throat, a slight difficulty breathing that would be present when you woke and would worsen throughout the day. This was so universal among the palace's inhabitants that it was not considered a medical condition. It was simply the baseline. By day 4, the social exhaustion would be as significant as the physical exhaustion. The constant performance required by the palace's etiquette, the sustained attention to protocol, the vigilance required to avoid further social errors, would be consuming energy that your body was not receiving adequate rest to replenish. You would be developing a kind of brittle, strained composure that looked appropriate from the outside and felt like desperation from the inside. Day 5 would bring a form of desperate adaptation. You would be learning which rooms were warmer, which servants were more helpful, which foods were safer to eat. You would be surviving, but surviving in the way that people survive genuinely hostile environments, by narrowing your focus to the immediate, by abandoning any ambition beyond getting through the next few hours. By day 6, you might be developing what looked like competence. The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable, and a week is long enough to begin calibration, even to an environment this foreign. But you would also be genuinely unwell in ways that were cumulative, and that a single week was not long enough to reverse. The cold, the smoke, the contaminated water, the social stress, the physical demands of the clothing and the protocol. All of it would be accumulating in your body as a debt that the week had created, and that leaving would be the only way to repay. On day 7, if someone offered you the door, you would take it without hesitation. Not because the palace was not extraordinary. It was extraordinary in ways that would haunt you for the rest of your life. But because your body would be telling you, clearly and without ambiguity, that it was not designed for this. That the gap between the performance of perfection that the palace required and the biological reality of being human inside it was not a gap that 1 week was sufficient to bridge. And through all of this, presiding over all of this, was Queen Victoria herself, the woman for whom this entire system existed and who was, in her own way, as trapped by it as anyone else. Victoria 1880 was 61 years old, a small, stout woman in perpetual black, ruling an empire that stretched across a quarter of the globe. From a series of cold rooms that she could never really escape, she had been queen since she was 18. She had outlasted prime ministers, foreign monarchs, and several generations of her own household staff. She knew exactly what she wanted and exactly how she wanted it, and she had 43 years of practice in making her wishes reality. But she was also a woman who had not been able to make a private decision about her own life since adolescence, whose every movement was choreographed, whose every word was recorded, whose every emotion was a matter of state policy. The palace that surrounded her was not her home. It was her office, her stage, her prison. She could not leave it without an elaborate process of preparation that involved dozens of people and multiple government departments. She could not alter it without consulting architects and treasury officials and parliamentary committees. She could not even change the temperature of her rooms without affecting the comfort of hundreds of other people whose presence was required for the palace to function. Victoria's own daily routine was as regulated as that of her lowest servant, just at a higher level of comfort. She rose at the same hour every day. She ate the same breakfast. She reviewed the same types of documents in the same order. She received the same officials at the same times. The spontaneity that makes life bearable was not available to her. Because spontaneity was incompatible with the machinery of empire, she was, in the truest sense, surviving the palace just as much as anyone else who lived there. The difference was that she had been doing it longer, and she had no alternative. The palace was not a choice for her. It was a condition of her existence, as permanent and as inescapable as her own skeleton. So the next time you look at a photograph of Buckingham Palace from the Victorian era, and you see the grand staircase, the sparkling chandeliers, the courtiers in their immaculate uniforms and silk gowns, Remember what you are actually looking at. You are looking at people who are freezing cold. You are looking at people breathing poisonous air. You are looking at people whose bodies are being slowly destroyed by the conditions they live in, and who cannot acknowledge that destruction because acknowledgement would be a violation of the social code that gives their lives meaning. The palace was not a sanctuary. It was not a refuge from the harshness of the 19th century. It was a machine designed to produce a specific type of performance, and the fuel that kept the machine running was human endurance. The glamour was real. The power was real. The beauty was real. But underneath all of that, supporting all of that, was a level of systematic human suffering that the people experiencing it had no vocabulary to describe and no mechanism to escape. You, arriving with your 21st century body, your 21st century assumptions, your 21st century immune system, and your complete absence of the institutional knowledge that the palace's inhabitants carried as second nature, would not survive a week. Not in the sense of dying, though the conditions were making their contributions to health outcomes that would only become visible over years, but in the sense of functioning, of performing what the environment required, of being what the palace needed its inhabitants to be. That woman in the portrait, standing perfectly composed in her black silk, managing her grief and her empire and her impossible building with the particular kind of endurance that only decades of practice can produce. She was not the effortless figure the portrait suggests. She was someone who had learned over a very long time how to survive. And the distance between her survival and yours is the distance between a world that shaped her and a world that shaped you. And it is, in the end, exactly 1 week wide.